The council chamber felt colder than before. The crystalline walls, which once shimmered with the soft glow of energy, now seemed dim, as if reflecting the tension that filled the air. Alpha stood at the center of the room, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Around him, the wax council members sat in a tight semicircle, their gazes shifting between him and the others in silent accusation. Lyra was there too, still weak from her ordeal but refusing to remain in recovery. She sat beside the council elders, her eyes flickering with concern. She knew what was coming, she could feel it in the air, in the way the energy pulsed erratically within the chamber. Councillor Valen, one of the oldest and most respected members of the Wax, leaned forward. "We were deceived," he said, his voice heavy. "The Trions have shown their true nature. We believed we could outlast them, defend ourselves without becoming like them. But now we stand on the edge of extinction." A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. Alpha remained silent, his gaze steady. He had known this conversation was inevitable. He had seen it in the weary eyes of his people, in the way they looked at the ruins of their cities. The Trions had pushed them to the brink, and the Wax were beginning to crack under the pressure. "You suggest we abandon everything we are?" Alpha finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "That we become what we swore never to be?" Councillor Saris, a younger but passionate member, shook her head. "We are already fighting, Alpha. This war is not one we chose, but it is one we are losing. If we do not change, we will be nothing but dust beneath the Trions' boots." A tense silence followed. The weight of their words pressed down on Alpha. He had always led with the belief that they could protect themselves without falling into the cycle of violence that had plagued so many civilizations before them. But what if he was wrong? What if their survival depended on making difficult choices, on becoming something else? Lyra shifted slightly, watching him closely. She understood his internal battle better than anyone. She had seen him struggle with the choices this war had forced upon him. "The Trions betrayed us," another counselor said. "But the real question is, have you betrayed us too, Alpha? By refusing to see what must be done." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Alpha's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the silent plea in their eyes. They were looking to him for answers, for a path forward. But the path they wanted, was one he wasn't sure he could walk. For the first time, Alpha felt something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. Doubt. Lyra stood on the high balcony of the council spire, the wind pulling at the edges of her flowing robes. Below, the heart of the Wax civilization pulsed with flickering lights, some steady, some broken, the scars of war still fresh upon their once pristine city. Towers of shimmering crystal bore deep fractures, their luminous cores dimmed by the recent destruction. The streets that once hummed with peaceful energy now carried an undercurrent of fear, of hesitation. She traced her fingers over the railing, feeling the cold beneath her touch. Every movement sent a sharp reminder through her body, bruised ribs, healing wounds, a dull ache in her shoulder where Trion restraints had cut into her skin. The physical pain was nothing compared to the weight in her mind. The war was twisting everything. Heavy footsteps echoed behind her. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. "You shouldn't be up," Alpha said, his voice calm, but laced with something unreadable. Lyra inhaled deeply before responding. "And you shouldn't be carrying all of this alone." He stepped beside her, his eyes scanning the broken horizon. "The council is on the verge of making a mistake." She turned to him, searching his face. There was exhaustion there, but something else, something darker. "You mean asking the humans for help?" His jaw tightened. "They don't understand what they're asking for. The humans are not our allies, Lyra. They created me, abandoned me, and they will do the same to the Wax if we show them weakness." Lyra exhaled slowly. "And if we don't ask for help? What then? How much longer can we fight a war we weren't built for?" Alpha's fingers curled into fists. We adapt. We endure. We don't betray everything we are. Lyra studied him carefully, feeling the weight of the moment between them. This isn't betrayal, Alpha. It's survival. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of the damaged energy barriers struggling to hold. She took a step closer, reaching out to touch his arm. I know you're afraid. I know what they did to you. But this isn't about the past. It's about the future. He looked down at her hand, then away. The future is built on choices. His voice was quieter now. And I don't know if I can make the right one. She squeezed his arm gently. You don't have to do this alone, Alpha. You never have. For a long moment, he remained still. Then, finally, he exhaled. The council will vote soon. His gaze hardened. And I won't let them doom us all. Lyra knew what that meant. The battle within the council chamber would be just as fierce as the war outside. And neither of them could afford to lose. The council chamber was tense, filled with a suffocating energy that crackled like a storm waiting to break. The great hall, once a place of quiet discussions and philosophical debates, now felt like a battlefield. Elders sat in their curved seats of carved crystal, their glowing eyes betraying a mix of fear, uncertainty, and defiance. The wax were not meant for war, yet here they were, torn between survival and the risk of trusting the very species that had created and abandoned them. Alpha stood at the center, his tall figure rigid, his silver blue eyes sweeping over the gathered leaders. He had faced Trion warriors, fought against overwhelming odds, but this, convincing his own people, was a different kind of battle. The humans will not save us, Alpha said, his voice firm, carrying across the chamber. They will use us. The moment we reveal ourselves to them, we become a problem they will want to control, or worse, eliminate. Across from him, Elder Virion leaned forward, his hands pressed together. And if we do nothing, Alpha? The Trions will destroy us piece by piece. Our people are dying. We cannot fight this war alone. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Lyra, standing near the entrance, watched the exchange with her arms crossed. She had already spoken with many of the elders before this meeting, pushing for a solution that didn't rely on desperation. Elder Celia, one of the oldest members of the council, stood slowly. Her luminescent gaze settled on Alpha. The Trions are relentless. They have no interest in peace. Our defenses are failing. Even with our advancements, we are losing this war. Do you not see that? Alpha's expression didn't waver. I see it, he said. But I also see what will happen if we turn to humans for help. They will come here, with their fleets and their weapons. And when the Trions are gone, we will not be free. We will simply have new masters. The weight of his words settled over the room. Then what do you propose? Virion asked, frustration creeping into his tone. Alpha exhaled slowly. We find another way. We focus on our own strength. The Nexus core is nearly stabilized. Our forces are learning, adapting. If we push forward, we can stand on our own. Lyra finally stepped forward. And if we can't? If the next attack comes before we're ready? A silence stretched between them. Alpha met her gaze, seeing the unspoken plea beneath her words. Finally, Elder Celia turned to the council. We must vote. A shimmering crystal was placed at the center of the chamber, pulsing gently with energy. One by one, the elders approached, placing their hands against its surface, their will etched into the light. The decision would be made. Alpha stood still, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. He had led his people through war, through loss, through the impossible. But this was the moment that would determine their future. Lyra closed her eyes for a brief moment. No matter which way the vote fell, she knew one thing for certain, this war was far from over. The council chamber was silent except for the low hum of the crystal at the center. Its glow flickered, shifting between deep blue and soft silver, an ancient system of decision-making that had guided the wax for centuries. The elders had cast their votes. Now, the fate of their people hung in the balance. Alpha's heart pounded in his chest as the final pulse of energy rippled through the crystal. He already knew what he wanted, what he believed was right. But the decision was no longer his alone. A slow, resonant chime echoed through the hall as the crystal settled into a single color, silver blue. The decision had been made. Elder Celia stepped forward, her luminous eyes scanning the chamber. "The council has spoken," she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "We will not seek aid from the humans." A wave of murmurs spread through the gathered wax leaders. Some looked relieved. Others, like Virion, tensed with barely restrained frustration. He turned sharply toward Alpha. "Then what? We wait to be slaughtered. We let the Trions wipe us from existence because of your fear of the past." Alpha met his gaze evenly. "We are not waiting. We are fighting. And we will do it on our own terms." Virion exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Foolish." Lyra watched the exchange with clenched fists. She had argued for restraint, for careful planning, but she also understood the desperation simmering beneath the surface. The wax had never faced a war like this before. And now, with the Trions closing in, many felt that refusing help was a death sentence. Celia raised a hand for silence. "Enough. The decision is final. We must move forward." She turned to Alpha. "You now bear the responsibility of proving that this was the right choice." Alpha nodded. "We will make preparations immediately. Our forces will strengthen, and the Nexus core will be completed. We will ensure that when the Trions come again, we will not fall." Lyra stepped beside him, her voice softer. "And if we're wrong?" Alpha didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The weight of his responsibility was already carved into his every step. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the council. "We have work to do." The chamber slowly emptied, but unease lingered in the air. Not everyone agreed with the decision. And Alpha knew that doubts could be just as dangerous as an enemy's weapon. As he left the hall, Lyra caught his arm, stopping him. Her gaze searched his face. "You're carrying this alone." His voice was quiet. "I have to." She held on to him for a moment longer before letting go. "Then let me carry it with you." Alpha said nothing, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to hope. Because whether he liked it or not, the next battle was coming. And the wax had chosen to stand alone. A deafening roar echoed through the skies. It started as a distant hum, a vibration in the air that sent a chill through the wax capital. Then, it became a full-force tremor, rattling the crystalline streets and causing shimmering buildings to flicker unsteadily. Above, the Trion fleet had arrived. Hundreds of warships broke through the cloud cover, their metallic exteriors pulsing with ominous red energy. Their sheer size cast unnatural shadows over the capital's elegant spires, an invading force blotting out the light of the twin suns. The city's defenses, weakened after the last battle, struggled to react fast enough. Then, the first strike came. A lance of crimson fire ripped through the sky, slamming into one of the outer districts. The explosion swallowed everything in its path, buildings shattered like glass, and a shockwave ripped through the streets, sending wax civilians tumbling. Screams filled the air. The energy barriers flickered, struggling to hold. Alpha stood at the highest balcony of the council chambers, watching as destruction unfolded beneath him. His expression was unreadable, but his hands clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. "They're here," Lyra's voice crackled through his earpiece. She was out there, somewhere in the chaos, coordinating defenses. Alpha turned sharply. "I see them. Get to the central core, now." They're going to target it. I'm already on my way. Her breath was labored. But Alpha, our defenses. Before she could finish, another blast struck. This time, it was close. Too close. The impact sent a massive shockwave through the central plaza, shattering energy lanterns and sending debris flying through the air. Alpha barely moved as dust and shattered crystal rained down around him. He was focused on one thing. The Trion ground forces had landed. Through the smoke, the towering figures of Trion warriors emerged, their metallic armor reflecting the fires around them. They moved with terrifying precision, cold, unshaken by the destruction. Weapons in hand, they marched forward, cutting down anything in their path. The Wax defenders, trained in energy combat, rushed to meet them. Energy whips cracked through the air, golden arcs of light clashing against the Trion's powerful exosuits. Warriors leaped, dodging, striking with blinding speed, but the Trions were relentless. Laser fire erupted from above as Trion aerial units rained destruction from their hovercrafts. Buildings collapsed. Entire streets became battlegrounds. Inside the council chambers, the elders stood frozen, their faces pale. They had seen war before, but never like this. A flickering holoscreen displayed the city's energy core, a massive crystalline structure pulsing with light at the center of Wax. If the Trions breached it, the entire city's defenses would fail. Alpha's jaw tightened. He turned to the assembled Wax warriors in the chamber. Get everyone out. Evacuate the non-combatants. Get them to the underground shelters. And you? One of the elders asked hesitantly. Alpha didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward and activated his wrist gauntlet. A pulse of blue energy surged around him, rippling through his body as he leaped over the balcony edge, descending straight into the chaos below. The moment his feet touched the ground, the battle found him. A Trion soldier, nearly twice his size, charged at him with a plasma blade crackling in his grip. Alpha sidestepped the first swing, his own energy flaring to life around his hands. With a controlled movement, he redirected the attack, twisting the Trion's arm before sending a devastating blast straight into its chest. The soldier was launched backward, crashing through a shattered building. More were coming. Dozens. Hundreds. Across the battlefield, the Wax warriors were fighting, but they were losing ground. The Trions had come prepared, their weapons calibrated to break through Wax defenses. One by one, Wax soldiers fell, their bodies collapsing under the weight of Trion firepower. Alpha's mind raced. The shields around the core were still holding, for now. But the Trions weren't stopping. If they reached the core, everything would be over. His earpiece buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Lyra's voice. It was General Kraylon. Surrender, Alpha, the deep, menacing voice oozed through the comms. Your civilization ends today. Alpha lifted his gaze to the sky. High above, a Trion flagship was charging its main cannon. This wasn't just a battle. It was an execution. And he had minutes to stop it. The battlefield was chaos. The Wax capital, once a beacon of peace, had become a war zone. The sky burned with the glow of explosions, and the streets were littered with shattered structures and the fallen. Smoke thickened the air, mixing with the metallic scent of energy discharge. Alpha moved like a phantom through the wreckage, his energy manipulation weaving around him as he struck with lethal precision. He cut down a Trion warrior with a single pulse to the chest, then turned, dodging a blast from another. His mind raced. The energy core still held, but the Trions were pushing forward in overwhelming numbers. Lyra was somewhere in the city, fighting alongside the defenders. His connection to her pulsed in the back of his mind like a tether, but there was no time to find her. If the capital fell, everything would be lost. He launched into the air, using his energy to propel himself to the remains of a shattered tower. From this vantage point, he saw the scale of the destruction. Trion forces had breached the outer sectors, their war machines rolling through the streets, obliterating Wax defenses. The energy barriers around the core flickered weakly. They wouldn't last much longer. A voice crackled in his earpiece. Alpha, the southern quadrant has collapsed. We can't hold them. It was one of his commanders, his voice strained with exhaustion. Alpha gritted his teeth. Fall back to the central square. Protect the core at all costs. He leaped down, landing in the thick of the battle just as a Trion warrior lunged at him. Alpha ducked, his reflexes honed to perfection. With a surge of power, he struck, sending his opponent crashing into a wall. Another came at him from behind, but he twisted, gripping the enemy's wrist and redirecting the attack before delivering a precise energy blast to the side of its head. The Trion crumpled instantly. More were coming. The fight was relentless. Every time a Wax soldier fell, another Trion stepped over them. The defenders were dwindling, their numbers crushed under the sheer might of the enemy. Then, the sky darkened. Above, the Trion flagship had begun charging its planetary cannon, a weapon capable of reducing the entire capital to rubble. Alpha's breath came hard and fast. There was no more time. If that weapon fired, there would be nothing left. His mind burned with the weight of the decision he was about to make. And then, against all odds, something unexpected happened. A fleet emerged from the void above the planet. Sleek, angular ships unlike any Wax or Trion design. The energy signatures were unmistakable. The humans had arrived. A new war was about to begin. The battlefield momentarily froze. Even the Trions, relentless in their assault, hesitated as the massive fleet descended from orbit. Their ships were sleek, metallic giants cutting through the darkness of space like silent predators. Alpha's heart pounded. He knew this moment would come, but not like this, not in the middle of devastation. His forces barely held the capital together, and now, another faction had entered the war. The human fleet spread out in formation, their weapons humming with immense power. Beams of energy lanced through the sky, striking Trion warships with terrifying precision. Several of the Trion vessels erupted into fireballs, their wreckage raining down onto the capital. The Trions reacted instantly. Their warships broke formation, turning their weapons toward the new arrivals. The air trembled as missiles and plasma fire arced through the sky, colliding with the human fleet. The battle above intensified, shadows of destroyed ships flickering across the ruins below. On the ground, Wax warriors watched in disbelief. They had spent their entire existence fearing the return of humanity. Now, they had come, but as what? Saviors? Conquerors? Lyra's voice cut through the chaos in Alpha's communicator. Alpha, are they helping us? Alpha didn't answer. He wasn't sure. Then, his communicator crackled with an unfamiliar voice. This is Admiral Holt of the United Earth Defense Fleet. We have received your distress signal and engaged the Trion forces. Do you require assistance? Alpha's jaw clenched. A message sent by the Council without his approval had brought humanity straight to their doorstep. Now, he had no choice but to respond. His hand hovered over the communicator. If he accepted their help, the Wax would survive this battle, but what would it cost them? If he refused, the Trions would unleash their full power, and there might not be another chance to turn the tide. Time was running out. Alpha took a breath. And made his decision. The battlefield had fallen into an eerie silence. Smoke curled into the sky from the shattered remains of Wax's capital, and the air was thick with tension. The once glowing crystalline spires now lay fractured, their energy flickering weakly. In the distance, the Trion warships hovered menacingly, their cannons locked on both the Wax and the newly arrived human fleet. Alpha stood at the forefront, his body aching from battle, his breath steady but heavy. Lyra was beside him, her gaze locked on the sky where the human ships loomed. Neither she nor Alpha had expected this turn of events. The humans had responded to the unauthorized distress call, but whether they were here as saviors or conquerors remained unclear. Across the field of battle, the Trion general, Kralon, stood atop a jagged piece of wreckage, his glowing red eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The Trions had been on the verge of total victory, but now the balance had shifted. The arrival of the humans complicated everything. A deep voice echoed through the comms, crackling with static. It came from the lead human vessel. "This is Commander Elias of the Earth Alliance fleet. We received a distress call. Identify yourselves. Are you in need of assistance?" Alpha clenched his fists. He knew the Wax Council had gone behind his back to make contact, but now that the humans were here, what was he supposed to do? If he refused their help, the Trions would destroy them. But if he accepted, he risked exposing Wax to the same species that had once sought to enslave him. Before Alpha could answer, Kralon's voice thundered across the battlefield. "Humans! Leave now. This is not your fight." A long silence stretched between them. The human commander did not reply immediately, likely calculating his next move. The Wax warriors around Alpha shifted nervously, glancing at one another. Even the Trion forces, previously aggressive and unrelenting, seemed hesitant. This was no longer a simple battle, it had become a political and military standoff where a single misstep could ignite a three-way war. Finally, Elias spoke again, his tone measured. "This planet does not belong to the Trions. We are prepared to intervene." Kralon's growl resonated through the comms. "Intervene?" His tone dripped with contempt. "You have no claim here. And you have no idea what you are walking into." Alpha exchanged a glance with Lyra. She was watching him, waiting for his decision. Her eyes, despite the exhaustion, still burned with defiance. He had sworn to protect his people, but how could he do that now? The fate of Wax stood on a knife's edge. The humans, the Trions, and the Wax, all poised to strike. One wrong move, and everything would be lost. The battlefield fell into a tense, eerie silence. The Wax forces, battered but still standing, held their ground near the ruins of their once proud capital. The human fleet hovered ominously above, their intentions unreadable. The Trions, despite their initial losses, showed no signs of retreat. Instead, their remaining warships shifted into a new formation, their dark metallic hulls reflecting the flickering fires of the burning city below. Then, the sky darkened. A massive structure emerged from the void, the apex cannon, the Trions' ultimate weapon. It was not just a warship, it was a harbinger of annihilation, a construct of incomprehensible destruction. The very air vibrated with the energy it emitted, an unnatural hum that made the Wax warriors instinctively step back. General Kralon's voice boomed through every communication channel, his tone dripping with cruel satisfaction. "Wax has no future. You will either surrender now, or you will cease to exist." Alpha's gaze locked onto the towering behemoth above. The apex cannon was not just a weapon, it was a planetary executioner. If fired, it could reduce all of Wax to ash within minutes. The defenses they had spent so long building would be meaningless against such raw, concentrated power. Lyra stood beside him, blood staining the fabric of her uniform. "We can't fight that," she said, her voice trembling. "Alpha, if they fire." He clenched his fists. "They won't." The Wax warriors around him watched, waiting for a command. Fear crept into their glowing eyes, but they trusted Alpha, even as the odds stacked against them. The human fleet remained still, their ships positioned between the Wax and the Trions. For now, they did nothing. But Alpha knew they were calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to act. They weren't here as saviors, they were watching, deciding whether to intervene or let the Wax burn. A warning shot fired from the apex cannon, a blinding lance of energy that struck the surface of a distant Waxian mountain. The explosion was unlike anything Alpha had ever seen, matter itself seemed to disintegrate, as if erased from existence. The ground trembled, shock waves rippling outward, shaking what was left of the capital. 1 minute, Kralon's voice returned. One final chance. Kneel before the Trions, or be wiped from the stars. The Wax Council stood frozen, whispering among themselves. Surrender? Was that even an option? Could they buy time? The humans had yet to act, and their silence was deafening. Alpha turned to his people. This was it, the choice that would decide the fate of Wax. He took a breath and stepped forward. No, he said. Kralon's laughter echoed across the battlefield. So be it. The Apex Cannon began to charge. The Apex Cannon's energy core ignited, pulsating with raw power as it prepared to fire. The sky above Wax turned a deep, unnatural red, as if the very atmosphere was being torn apart by the overwhelming force gathering within the weapon. Every second felt like an eternity. Alpha stood unmoving, his mind racing through every possible scenario. There was no defense against a weapon of this scale. Even their strongest energy barriers would shatter instantly. If the cannon fired, Wax would be nothing but dust. Lyra grabbed his arm, her voice urgent. Alpha, we have to do something. Now. His golden eyes locked onto the human fleet. They still hadn't moved, still hadn't fired a single shot. Were they waiting for a sign? Did they want proof that the Wax were worth saving? Or were they simply letting the battle play out, ready to claim the ruins afterward? The countdown continued. 10 seconds. The Wax warriors braced themselves, their hands glowing with energy, but it was futile. No amount of resistance would stop what was coming. The council members stood frozen, their faces torn between fear and resignation. Some of them looked at Alpha, waiting for him to surrender. Others were already mourning their home. 5 seconds. Alpha's fists clenched. He had only one option left. He turned his focus inward, drawing on every ounce of power within him. The energy within his body surged, brighter than ever before, his entire form pulsing with intensity. He had never pushed himself this far, never attempted something so reckless. But there was no other way. The Apex Cannon reached full charge. A blinding sphere of energy formed at its core, expanding outward, preparing to unleash destruction. Alpha raised his hands toward the sky. The air around him cracked with pure force as he channeled everything he had. He reached out, not just with power, but with something deeper. The energy of Wax itself. The land, the sky, the very essence of the planet. He called upon it, not to shield, but to disrupt. He had one chance. One moment to redirect the force before it was too late. The Apex Cannon fired. A beam of unimaginable power shot downward, roaring toward the surface. The Wax capital, their home, their people, everything would be erased. Alpha roared as he unleashed his energy, sending a shockwave straight into the heart of the beam. The two forces collided, the sheer impact splitting the sky apart. The ground trembled, the air vibrated violently, and a blinding explosion of white engulfed everything. For a brief moment, nothing existed but light. Then, the sky shattered. The Apex Cannon's blast fragmented, splitting in multiple directions, its energy scattering like a dying star. Some of it dispersed harmlessly into space. Some of it tore through the Trion fleet, ripping their ships apart in an instant. The rest exploded harmlessly across the distant wastelands of Wax, sparing the capital. Silence. The Apex Cannon itself flickered, its core destabilizing. Then, in a final, cataclysmic rupture, it detonated, taking half of the remaining Trion fleet with it. Alpha collapsed to one knee, his vision fading. He had done it. He had stopped the blast. But at what cost? As the dust settled, one final presence remained on the battlefield, the human fleet, still watching, still waiting. And then, for the first time, they moved. A single transmission came through. This is Admiral Hawthorne of the United Earth Coalition. Stand down, Alpha. It's time to talk. Alpha looked up, breathless, his body shaking. It had only just begun.